This second standard in the blood unit explicitly covers white blood cells. Your standard reads, I can explain the classification, function, formation, life cycle, and count of white blood cells, and this is still covered in section 14.2 of your textbook. Last time you mentioned that blood is a liquid matrixed connective tissue that is primarily responsible for transporting substances, whether it's oxygen or nutrients, waste, or heat. But we said there are four primary components. Last lecture, we talked about red blood cells or erythrocytes. In this lecture, we're going to cover white blood cells, which are known as leukocytes. We are not going to talk about platelets or plasma yet. Your new heading for today, BLOOD.2, white blood cells. So as I mentioned, white blood cells are called leukocytes. Their primary function is not to carry specific things like oxygen or hormones to a designated location. Their job is to protect you against disease. And being in the blood is a wonderful location for them because they're capable of moving throughout your body to address different cuts or scrapes or points of infection. They're still produced in the red bone marrow under a hormonal control mechanism, a homeostatic mechanism, but we're not going to talk as explicitly about it. Another major difference between white blood cells and red blood cells is that white blood cells can live up to several years. While red blood cells only live about 4 months, it makes sense for a defensive cell to be around for a while because they may not always be functioning, and it's helpful to have memory of previous invaders or previous infections. Overall, you don't have a lot of these, especially in comparison to erythrocytes. They make up less than 1% of your blood volume, but they're very obvious and very visual on a blood smear. We're going to talk about the 5 specific types of leukocytes, which are broken up into 2 main categories. Granulocytes have really grainy cytoplasm and contain neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, while agranulocytes have smoother cytoplasm and contain lymphocytes and monocytes. So let's start with the granulocytes. For each type, we're going to talk about what is their specific defense against, what does an elevated or lowered count mean, and about how many of them you have. So neutrophils, this first image here, by the way, you can see the grains in the cytoplasm in all 3 of these. But neutrophils are your first responders. They're the first cells to arrive at an infection site, and they're really strong phagocytes. They're capable of surrounding, engulfing, consuming any foreign cells. The bulk of your white blood cells are neutrophils, 54 to 62%, because they're very general defenders. If you have a high count of these, it is likely that a medical professional will suspect a bacterial infection, as those are the most common invaders. Eosinophils, the second cell here, is meant to defend specifically against parasitic worms and allergens. So these are not bacteria, these are not viruses. This is parasites or things that your body recognizes as a foreign substance, aka an allergen. Very few of these, 1 to 3% of your white blood cells, are eosinophils. And if we do see that elevated count, we're obviously going to think about worm infestations or severe allergic reactions. Basophils don't have a specific defense purpose. They're the one white blood cell that doesn't share that function, but it does release 2 very important hormones. It releases histamine to stimulate inflammation, and what that means is when it senses foreign invaders, it is going to open up those blood vessels nearby and rush blood to the area, because that's going to bring more neutrophils, it's going to bring more eosinophils, more agranulocytes, and so we want to have that tissue get increased blood flow. At the same time, we want to make sure we're not clotting our blood inside of our body. If we have more blood in an area, we might get some platelets sticking together, and so it also releases heparin to stop unwanted blood clotting. It's not going to stop the blood clotting that you have from an injury. It'll still work there. It's just stopping from internal clots. Less than 1% of your leukocytes, because their function is very non-defensive. Less than 1% need to be basophils. On the other side, your agranulocytes, we have much smoother cytoplasm. We have monocytes that also phagocytize bacteria, just like neutrophils. But they also go around and clean up dead cells and any debris that's been left over. So monocytes are like the cleanup crew. 3 to 9% of your white blood cells are monocytes, and if we see an elevated count in these, we'll also suspect a bacterial infection. The other white blood cell, the last one, is, in my opinion, the most important, and there's two specific kinds. So lymphocytes are categorized as either T cells or B cells. T cells directly attack foreign pathogens and tumors. So if cancer ever pops up in your body, most of the time you don't know about it because your T cells take care of it once they recognize that there are cells dividing out of control. B cells, on the other side, are not going to directly attack anything, but they are going to produce antibodies against specific antigens. So when you get a vaccine, what you're doing is you are putting dead viral pieces, dead viral DNA, or even the virus itself in really small doses into your body so that B cells can recognize it and then start to produce antibodies that, if you ever get exposed again, will already be ready to fight that invasion. 25 to 33% of your leukocytes are lymphocytes, whether T or B cells. And these ones live for years to provide that long-term immune response that we want, for instance, if we've exposed you to a vaccine. There are 4 primary functions of white blood cells that have specific names. So first, diapedesis is when white blood cells leave the blood vessel to migrate towards the infection site. So sometimes the blood vessel is not close enough to the damage, and so the white blood cells will leave through that simple squamous wall and migrate towards the infection site. Phagocytosis is when they engulf and digest those pathogens. Largely that's monocytes and neutrophils. Inflammatory response is when white blood cells cause that swelling and open up the capillaries a little bit. That would be your basophils. Lastly, positive chemotaxis is when white blood cells are attracted to an infection site because other chemical signals from other damaged cells are drawing them towards the area. It's a way to get more defenses to the front lines. When discussing count, same thing as a red blood cell count. We count the number of WBCs this time in a cubic millimeter of blood, and we list out each specific leukocyte. So a normal count is about 3,500 to 10,500. If we have a high count, that's usually an infection of some sort, or maybe we've lost body fluids. If there's a low count, we suspect specific disorders like HIV and AIDS, polio, the flu, etc. There is a chart from your textbook, table 14.4, that goes into more specific white blood cell changes and various diseases to consider. Your case study for the blood unit talks about leukemia. Leukemia is cancer of the blood, and so you will learn about which cells are primarily affected and what are the effects of someone who is suffering from leukemia.